What to do, what to do. This is the Brothers on Books podcast, where we find great books that will give you real value and actionable steps and have fun in the process. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com if you have any book recommendations or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to would be greatly appreciated. Lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. If it's a dark and stormy night and you need a drink to warm the depths of your heart, we at the Brothers on Books go with Encha Matcha, the best matcha for the best brothers. And now our listeners will get 10% off and they can use the link or the coupon code in the show notes. I'm Alex Elwell, and with me as always is my brother Jack Elwell. Jack, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, Al. It's a funny circumstance. You're on European soil, I'm in North America, and by the time this releases, you'll be in Israel.
That's right. I'm currently sitting in the Athens airport recording this on my way to Israel, and this is the first time I've been to Europe and out of the country since we went to Scandinavia in
Is that
2016.
true? Wow.
Yeah,
That's a that's like 8 years, right?
yeah. I essentially didn't
Wow.
travel at all in grad school. I
Wow. Okay.
think I took one. Well, that's not technically true. I took one cruise, but like there's I don't even count it. It's like a Caribbean cruise. We left out of Miami, went to like St. Martin's or something.
Mhm.
So so I guess Jack, you chose this book. How did you come up on it?
Yeah, so I chose From Hamas to America. This was one of the three books I picked in the book draft. It was also in the current events section at Barnes and Noble. So we've heard Mosab Hassan Yousef talk a lot on, at least I have, on Piers Morgan. But I've listened to him more so now, and I ended up watching his movie, The Green Prince, which he talks about a little bit in this book. And I've just been kind of drawn to him because it's rare that we get a glimpse into some of the Eastern style of living, I guess. I feel like the language barrier is a big one. I mean, there's obviously huge cultural differences, and he's one of the few that is, I guess, bridging the gap and trying to allow people to understand. So I thought it would be an interesting book. I didn't really know too much about his upbringing or life, and so I thought it would be a good book.
It's super also interesting when he's essentially debated on Piers Morgan. Like he's often debating like very pro-Palestinian people, primarily the ones that come to mind is Cenk Uygur. And it's always interesting in that whole say like what Hamas stands for, being that he essentially lived in the group and his opposition will like still essentially not believe him. Uh,
Hmm.
Essentially just discredit him, call him propagandist, or I guess I didn't realize from those debates, I didn't realize he was so deeply tied to Christian religion. But I guess one of the common slurs is like a Christian Zionist, which is kind of interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, I think part of, and he touched on this in the back part of the book when he's discussing when they were filming the movie, The Green Prince, which went through his story on leaving the West Bank and after conspiring with Shin Bet, which is like the CIA of Israel, and kind of that whole saga and how his family disowned him. Um, but basically, he alludes to when you're kind of making a movie or being interviewed, they're trying to paint a certain picture, and on TV, it seems like he's very anti, like the Palestinian cause or like in the West Bank. Um, but yeah, it's rarely mentioned. I feel that he kind of gravitated towards Christianity, or at least the life of Jesus, maybe more so. And they kind of try to paint a picture because he seemed much more critical of Israel in the book than he has on like TV sources.
Yeah, I mean, at times I felt like he was pretty critical of Israel in the book, but on the like when I hear him debate, he talks about Israel like it's the greatest country, and I think it's. I mean, you probably have to come at it from a comparative analysis, and that compared to its neighbors, it is probably the greatest country, but still has a lot of problems, which I think people tend to forget.
Mhm. So okay, so let's get into maybe some more of the actual aspects of the book. So he grew up in Ramallah, and that is part of the West Bank. So the West Bank is this area next to Israel, between Israel and Jordan. And his father, Hassan Yousef, was a I think the most famous like imam in the West Bank, and or like basically like a pastor or rabbi for the mosque. And it's I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but did he actually start Hamas, or was he just like kind of like the leader?
My understanding is that he was one of the founders of Hamas,
Uh-huh. So yeah,
but
it's
but
just
not
kind of.
the military. He wasn't involved in the military wing. He was part of like the political wing.
But he kind of talks that he attributes some of his like speaking or not having stage fright to his father, and his father would talk to all these people, and these people would travel from all over to come hear his father speak, and his father had him speak from a young age, but it sounded like the language his father used was kind of violent. And I did watch some of his speeches, and it sounds very angry. It sounds like it's kind of trying to divide and conquer. He's trying to make out the other side to be the enemy, very much so. And he talked about this dynamic in the book, and I honestly compared it to. I felt like he was comparing it to when he would go to these churches later on in the U.S. and speak. It was almost like some of the people were unhappy with him not just berating the other side and that like Muslims wrong, everyone should be Christian. And he was kind of talking about this dynamic that anyone who's getting talked to like in a religious setting, they kind of want to be told what they're doing is correct and that they're on the good side. And that, we have these enemies and we need to vanquish them.
Yeah, I feel like he touched on the fact that he always got half of it wrong. That he was critical of Islam, but he was not always, I guess, praising how they view the world, or like how they viewed, I guess, in that context, Jesus. Um, Back to your point about his father, it's interesting because the book starts in the beginning of the book. He's talking growing up. He's talking about the divide between Hamas and Fatah, and that
Mhm.
Hamas is essentially the minority in the West Bank at that point, and he's getting bullied. It's like essentially the internal divide within the West Bank, and he's getting bullied because he is the son of one of the Hamas founders, by not the Israelis, but by these other, I guess, liberation organizations. And
Yeah, I
then,
was talking about this dynamic of Fatah and Hamas, and it honestly sounded just like a normal like U.S. gang kind of like they're painting graffiti, and then so like Hamas will paint graffiti one night, but then the next night the Fatah kids will like go and cover over the prior night Hamas graffiti with their graffiti, and it kind of just seemed like kind of like gangs.
yeah, I agree with that. Just like people, like seemed like people that didn't know what to do to try to really try and get their to meet their ends, that they just fought amongst themselves less.
Mhm.
Um, so like going into, I guess the thing that one of the main points I found interesting was how he described his relationship with the I guess with Shin Bet, with the Israelis. He obviously had a great relationship with his original handler, the Gonen, uh, but he was let go, and then his second handler he spoke very poorly of. uh, which I
Well, I guess
found.
I, I guess maybe we should step back and like, how did he, it is an interesting story. How did he even start talking with Shin Bet? Because it was, he, he got so upset that I can't remember if someone he knew died but basically him and his cousin were they got a gun and they got stopped. And he's only 17 years old, I think, at that time. And, well, at least a teenager. And they got stopped and he got put in prison. And to me, it seemed like I got actually, when I watched the Green Prince, maybe I got a little bit more of a flavor of like what he was thinking at that time. Because in the book, it wasn't super clear why he decided to turn. But when he was in prison, I think he saw how the Hamas people were treating each other. And he's like, wait, this is what, we're fighting for? Like, this is how we're treating each other. And like, and he was like, before he was ready to die for the cause. A lot of people were ready to, fight for the cause. And I think what triggered him was what he saw from Hamas when he was in prison and how they treated each other. And then he's like, well, is this really what I want to be fighting for? And then I think and then basically Shin Bet is trying to turn virtually every new prisoner. And when Shin Bet is asking, when they ask everyone, and then when those prisoners get released to the common ground, they're asking those prisoners like, oh, did Shin Bet try to turn you? And most they would say like if they said no, then most of them assumed that they had turned. But Mosab said, yeah, they asked me to be an agent, and I said yes, because I can now kind of be like a double agent or a triple agent or whatever you want to call it. But he was just truthful for the whole time. But that's kind of how he got introduced to Shin Bet. And it sounds like he spent many, many months in prisons sporadically to either that original case or afterwards to kind of protect his identity or protect his physical safety, because otherwise he might have been assumed to be an agent and killed.
Yeah, I think sort of touching. He brought up that if they thought you had turned, they would torture you and string you up for and kill you, like Hamas said it, if they thought you turned.
Yeah.
So he
Yeah,
does.
I remember him discussing like the needles under the fingernails. They would burn plastic on your skin. I mean, these all sound like awful ways to be tortured.
Yeah, and then but the other interesting thing was some of the tactics Shin Bet used were pretty extreme. They talked about driving one guy up up into Lebanon, into the southern border where like the Lebanon Christians lived, I guess. Like essentially, staging Hezbollah capturing them after they sent him out into a minefield to elicit, then to prove himself, he would have to say everything he's done. And they just got everything this guy had done in his life that he had been so adamant in not releasing in this setup. And then they just immediately retook him back down into Israel, into the prison, and broke him. Just
Yeah.
very extreme and very sophisticated measures.
Yeah, definitely a lot of resources went into interrogating some of these people. And I mean, Mossad is going through what Hamas is instructed. Like, if you're taken prisoner, you're not to talk to anyone, basically. You're not to trust anyone. Even if you have a cellmate that's speaking Arabic, and praying 5 times a day like a traditional Muslim, like, you're not supposed to talk to anyone. So sometimes in the book he's kind of talking through these dynamics of like when certain people tend to crack or when they start to talk. And sometimes it's just from isolation, sometimes it's just months and months of not being able to talk about your culture, or and then yeah, that extreme example you brought up kind of read like a James Bond like setup.
Yeah, I mean, and he does like sort of like what I was saying in the beginning, like where in the debates it seems like he holds Israel in incredibly high esteem. In this book, he does acknowledge that like what they are doing is forms of torture, even if it isn't acknowledged as torture by whoever these UN or whatever. So I think he
Mhm.
brought up like waterboarding and like solidarity, isolation, all
Yep.
those things.
Yep.
Um,
And he did use words like a prison for Gaza, which I feel like he kind of argues against when he's on TV, but he did. I mean, this was later in the book when his sister was marrying the guy in Gaza, which is also a crazy story if we want to get into. But
yeah,
he did
why don't you
describe.
just explain? Why don't you just explain that? Well, it happened twice essentially.
Um,
There's like both of his
what's that?
sisters. There's like two of the three sisters had these like really bizarre marriages.
Yeah. So okay. So it seemed like his father had a friend. They both grew up in the West Bank. The one friend had moved to America, three sons. The whole brigade, like the father and the three sons, come to the West Bank, and they basically are arranged marriages essentially. And so the one son takes his sister to, of all places, Dearborn, Michigan, who where he'll later visit and describe her existence as basically a slave, um, in isolation. So not that pretty of a picture for her. The other sister, which is really this story is like nuts to me, but she got arranged with the one brother who I think was like a banker in San Francisco, but he flew back to America and left her. So this is Mosab's sister with his parents in the West Bank, and she was just like taking care of the parents for like I think like years. And I think he didn't grant her divorce for like 4.5 years. But then it gets even crazier, because when Mosab's father is in prison, though there was a guy that I think had butchered a bunch of Israelis and was in prison with Mosab's father, and the guy asked if he could marry his daughter, and Mosab's father said yes, even though he was in prison. But then an Israeli got taken hostage, and then I think there was like a hostage for prisoner swap. So it sounded like they released like 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli hostage, and the butcher was one of them. So the butcher got sent to Gaza, and then Mosab's sister had to go to like Jordan and then fly to Egypt and then get smuggled into Gaza. And just, yeah, it's like kind of crazy to think about like the feats they're going to go to what he describes as a prison.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just sort of tangent of that, but like talking on the aspects of it, he brings up later in the book. He sort of talks about like the banking sector in America compared to the banking sector in like the West Bank, and how he spent all this time and money fixing up his apartment, and then when he was fleeing to America, he sold it to his uncle, and his uncle like kept telling him he would give him money for it, and he just essentially never did. And it had to do with like essentially how you can't get a mortgage, I guess there. Like they don't you need cash is what I was understanding for everything. I don't know, did you think that too?
Well, from okay, so yeah, Mossad did seem to be living a pretty rich comparative life in the West Bank, because he was getting paid from Shin Bet. I think he was getting some, I'm guessing Hamas money, some sort of support that way. So it sounded like he had an apartment that was, I think he sold it for like 60,000, I want to say, to his uncle, and the
Well,
uncle basically stiffed him. But
well,
I,
he
in
sold it for
terms
he
of the
gave it away.
Yeah, in terms of on the interest topic, I've talked with some Muslims on this, and it seems like even though the I don't know if it's technically in the Quran that it says interest is taboo, but uh, that's the way they kind of live. But he's saying a lot of Muslims do take out debt for certain things, so it is not unheard of to have a loan as a Muslim.
So I think it's against, I think it's also said in the Bible as well, to be fair, that you're not supposed to charge interest.
Uh-huh.
This is how Jews originally were the original bankers, is
Hmm.
that Christians, and I think to that extent Muslims, were not supposed to charge other Christians and Muslims interest, so no one would do it. So that's why
Hmm.
like originally Jews stepped into the banking sector.
Hmm. Yeah, but I think yeah he had agreed on a price because okay, so I guess let's discuss why he had to leave or why he felt he had to leave the West Bank. And I think it was he basically had, he had saved lives through preventing some of these suicide bombers, but at some point, I think what some of the information he gave, he basically had to leave for his safety. Um, and he had to leave pretty quick. And I think he was going to ask for a higher price, but because he had to leave so quick, he asked for a lower price, and the uncle agreed. I think it was 60,000, and he said he would give, I'll give you 30,000 in like a couple weeks, and then send the other 30 in a few months or something like that, some sort of arrangement like that. And then when Mosab actually got to America, and once again he's got like nothing, he's got really like nothing of value with him, like a backpack, and no money's coming in, and he keeps trying to get the money from his uncle, and I think he ends up giving him like 2 grand. That's it. That's all Mosab asked for at the end.
Yeah, but he doesn't get the 2 grand either.
Oh, okay, I forgot that part. Okay.
He says in the end,
um
yeah, just give me 2 grand. And the uncle says yes. And then there's like a little section where he's sitting at like a wire transfer place and the money just never comes.
mhm. Yeah.
But like the point that I thought broke him was he always had to do these uh these lie detector tests, and his new handler made him do a lie detector test, told him he failed, had him come back the next day, told him he passed. And like after that, he felt like he's like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like I feel like they still don't trust me after 10 years, like type of thing. Like I'm getting out. And he decided to go to America. But like and then it later came out that I guess the person in Israel who's in charge of like the polygraph test said he should never be subjected to a polygraph test because he would always fail because of like
Yeah.
how he like lives his life. And
Right.
he
Yeah.
he like
The
felt
second.
like
Mhm.
yeah, he felt like the handler was just trying to control him, like, you know, sort of like take away his freedom, which I feel like was a big part of how he lived his life. He always wanted to like strive to be free.
Yeah. The first handler he had built a lot of trust with on the. If you do have a chance, the listeners, to watch the Green Prince, you might want to watch because his handler is actually talking. The first handler is a big part of that documentary. So he built up a lot of trust, and then the second handler, came in and kind of wants to start from scratch, and obviously shows he doesn't trust them by giving the polygraph. And yeah, I mean they're asking questions like, have you ever arranged a terrorist attack against Israel? And his thinking is like, well, yeah, that's what you want me to be undercover and pretend to be a terrorist to give you guys information. That's what I've been doing for like a decade for you guys. So it's like kind of conflicted in like how, like, what is going on in his mind and how he would perform on a polygraph because he's getting paid to act like a terrorist for you. Yeah, and that was.
The other
And I.
the other sort of interesting point was he made it sound like they knew. Well, for one, he also made it sound like there was no cross communication between the Israeli branches. Because like he talked about like how at times the IDF was still looking for him.
Yep.
Uh, but like it's like they didn't know he was an undercover agent who shouldn't bet, which is like wild to me. I guess it like prevents leaks, but in the same note, like they're smuggling them out. They're like smuggling them out from like war zones where the IDF is essentially still trying to kill them at times, which is
Hmm.
got to be wild. Uh, and how little communication there is between those groups. Like, I don't know if that's how, I feel like that's probably also how our government operates. Like, there's not a lot of communication between these federal groups.
Hmm. Yeah, I think part of it was to protect, you know, his safety and um yeah, I mean they kind of have to make it look like he's a real terrorist and treat him like any other terrorist. But, he'd be getting like a heads up like, "Yo, we're about to like, bomb your block. You better leave." And but at the same time, he did this also to protect his father. His father probably would have been killed way before, and part of the arrangement was, you're going to give me a heads up on where you're going, so my father stays safe. And of course, the father's like, praise Allah, he's like keeping me safe. Like the IDF have checked every house in our block except ours, and he's like in the basin, and just kind of funny, but yeah, on the
And the other,
basically
the
after
other
that
interest,
that polygraph, he said he wanted a break, and he got Shin Bet to agree to allow him to travel. And I think part of it was he had to make it look like he was going to get a surgery like outside, I think a jaw surgery. And the other one was they said he's got to come back. And they wanted him to go to Europe because I guess the IDF or Shin Bet can operate in Europe without much cooperation with the local governments. But like if he were to go to America, basically Shin Bet has to notify the American offices and get like authorization, or like basically they would have to work together. It couldn't just be like Shin Bet going and bring him back on a plane, and like they could in Europe. It's a little different if he went to America, and he ended up going to America.
yeah, he went to America and he essentially just started bumming around with people he was friends with. He met this couple that was working on, I think, water filtration or like clean water for the Palestinians out of this Christian group. He stayed with them for a while, and then he stayed with like a cousin for a while. But after a time, like things kind of in all of these situations, things kind of eventually like wore thin, and he kind of overstayed his welcome. Is like what it seemed like to me, at least how it was
Mhm.
painted in the book. And then he had to leave.
Well, what did you think about his anxiety? Because he talks about like when he's in the West Bank, it's more like a fight for his physical safety. But then he's discussing how in America, it's kind of like you have this angst because of the financial stresses. Now, I don't know if it was just because I mean he's brand new in a country, and like one would expect for you to have financial stresses regardless of what country you were to move to. But that's kind of the picture he painted, where it's just like a different type of stressor.
Yeah, I mean, he made it sound like that original couple he was with in was like over leveraged in the real estate market around '08, and when that collapsed, they were having a lot of problems and it put massive strain on their uh on their marriage. And yeah, he sort of was making it sound like, yeah, they're definitely, we as a foreigner have this picture of America being like this great place, but there are definitely a lot of problems associated with like the American way of life. That's at least how I took it.
Mhm. But on the flip side, he kind of, I mean, he's very adaptable. I guess that's the the theme in his life is he's kind of just like going with the flow, for lack of a better phrase, like being water. Because like he's being like Hamas, and then he's kind of like rolling with Shin Bet, and And then, just going when he fears for his life, he's just leaving altogether. And then he kind of, infiltrates the culture, tries to understand the systems, and he understands that you can get paid a lot for stories and speaking. So when he was struggling financially, and couch hopping, essentially, I think that's when he thought, like, oh, and I think someone approached him about writing a book, and that first book was Son of Hamas, and he's like, yeah, I mean, maybe I should do it. And like a lot of different churches and groups were paying him to speak, so he kind of found the American way in that sense.
Well, you missed the first thing was the first thing was the article, the interview he gave with the Israeli reporter uh Avi, I'm blanking on the guy's last name, where he said he was disowning Islam for Christianity. And then
Hmm.
all these Christian churches started paying him and giving him donations to come speak. And then when he wrote the book, like, yeah, it was another influx. Uh
Hmm.
it's like the article was like the first bomb, and then like the book was like the super big bomb, where it
Hmm.
started getting like a lot of money. Sound like.
Yeah. Actually, now that you say that, that was pretty insightful of him to go to Haaretz, to run that article. Um,
Right. That essentially got him in one way, like it painted a the way I would have thought about it is like I would want to lay low, but like I think after he came out, like they couldn't come target him, because then it's like, well, how did they, why is this guy getting targeted, who's like known to do this? And I don't know if you ever listened to that interview, but there was that Iranian woman, I think Erica Laban. He was saying like when like Islamic regimes try and like attack you, the first thing they do is try and discredit you, and then they try and like just discredit you, slander you, and then at the end they'll try and kill you. But like if you're so big, they can't really physically attack you, because then people will look into it.
mhm. But I guess within the church community, once that article, I hope I'm remembering this right, but the some of the church members became kind of scared that he might become or is now a target. So some almost wanted to distance themselves from him, which I think was isolating for him because I mean, he's without his family. He's got very few friends, and now like the church community is essentially distancing themselves from him because he's a terrorist target.
I was saying something. Yeah, not only was he a terrorist target, he was an accused terrorist. Like he was still on the watch list as a terrorist, because he hadn't publicly come out as being working with Shin Bet. And I think at that point he was either up for deportation, or he had lost his asylum case and was like on the appeal to be deported as a
Hmm.
as a terrorist. So
Hmm.
I feel like that's a lot of stress probably to deal with.
Hmm. But at the same time, he was also after that first book. I don't know if it was actually before the book when he already started getting. Well, I guess yeah, the Haaretz article started getting him speaking engagements, and he started to make a lot of money. I think. Um, and then the book came out, and he made even more money. And then they decided to shoot that movie, The Green Prince. So he became pretty wealthy. It sounded like. So he describes these California parties he's throwing, and I think he bought like a Porsche, and it seemed like he had kind of cracked the code to the American way of making money.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Uh, and it definitely seemed like at the end he became a little disenfranchised with that way of living. He talked about it sort of being like he was happy that he had those experiences where he got a party and do all these things, but felt like, at least what I was taking from it, it seemed like at the end he was saying it was kind of meaningless, and he was looking for like deeper fulfillment in his life, which is how I don't think they ever said what island he went to, but he went and like became really into yoga. He
Mhm.
does yoga every day now, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah. Somewhere, yeah, somewhere in Southeast Asia. Yeah, I wonder if for security reasons he didn't mention where it was. Um, but yeah, he grapples with this. I mean, he brought it up, like the idea of your possessions kind of owning you at some point. It just costs money to maintain. You worry about losing what you have. So almost this idea that he would say you're like more free from fear when you have less and less material wealth, basically. And he just talks about traveling just with a backpack and owning very few things.
Yeah, very true. But still keeping all of his money in a bank because you can't. Yeah, it's good to have the money, I guess. I was surprised at how many people he brought up these stories with all these people just offering to give him these massive sums of money. Like some billionaire, I think he didn't give the guy's name. One Jewish billionaire, he said offered to give him like $500,000 just to try and do better with what he was doing. And it's just like no strings attached. I mean, allegedly no strings attached money, but I mean, that's just wild to me.
Mhm. It's kind of this like interesting barrier. It feels like there's like two worlds almost. And I feel like the upper world is almost like more generous, more cooperative, and it kind of it goes back to that like idea, like it's kind of funny how money starts to follow you when you don't need it, and it kind of just starts to flow to you when you're like least obsessed with it, and then the people that are so obsessed with it never seem to have enough or never seem to get it. I couldn't get that out of my head when he was describing that, because yeah, that was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I mean to turn it down is also like pretty crazy. Uh,
Hmm.
well, it's just like wild. I mean,
Well, I think was, I mean, I don't really exactly remember what he said, but I mean, I think he just didn't want to like feel like he owed anyone. Is that kind
yeah,
of,
that's what he
yeah,
said. Right.
yeah.
He just
Um,
didn't he didn't think it was real. He didn't think it was actually no strings attached.
um, yeah. What did you think about like his, because I mean, he had a very obviously turbulent upbringing, and he does talk about getting raped when he was very young by like this, man, like a 22-year-old, like, old boy, basically. And he did seem he's got a lot of demons, obviously, and he kept trying to do like thrill-seeking activities. I think he talked about, driving on these hairpin turns on a motorcycle at 90 miles an hour. He's talking about jumping out of airplanes, parachuting. I think he did like 10 plus jumps, and just kind of trying to get that next rush. And even his physical activity, like later on, I think he describes spending time in Arizona, and he's like biking like 30 to 50 miles, like 3 to 4, 5 days a week. I mean, these sound like extreme activities, and it's, I feel kind of bad because, yeah, he's kind of just trying to, I guess, numb what he's feeling about his past life.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. He doesn't. He brings up the fact that he was raped in this book, but he doesn't really talk about it. I think he talked. I didn't read the first book. He talks about it. It's my understanding he talks about it a lot in the first book. And I've heard him talk about it a lot in interviews, but I feel like he just sort of brought it away as like a throwaway line. The problem with that thrill thing, that thrill seeking stuff, it's the same issue with drugs. Is that like once you start doing it, to get the same the same essentially release, you need to do more of it. So it's like it's hard. It becomes harder and harder to get that same like dopamine hit, which is why I think people tend to kind of like spirals into like more and more extreme behavior because you're just
Mhm.
like running for that next hit, um, which is kind of what it seemed like was happening. Which is what it kind of seemed like was happening to me for him.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, I feel like it eventually would all just wear off, and then he kind of would stop doing it. And it seemed like the yoga was more of a balanced like a balanced thing where he was able to do some like introspection and like kind of meditate a little bit on his life and what he really
Mhm.
wants.
But I vaguely remember him saying there were mornings where he would do like 3 hours of yoga, and like to me that's also extreme. It's like,
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, I couldn't imagine doing that much yoga.
yeah. Um, and then um I guess he did. I guess let's talk a little bit about like his immigration case too. So eventually, he did get U.S. citizenship, which was a pretty big deal because it seemed like there was a pretty hard line in the sand that if you were associated with a terrorist group, you're not getting U.S. citizenship. Um, but I think his case was, he's now converted to Christianity, and if he got sent back, he's basically gonna be killed.
Well, his original argument was he was seeking religious asylum. He was essentially seeking religious asylum from religious persecution. Because since he had
Mhm.
converted, if he was sent back, yeah, he would be killed. But I think then when he said, well, he brings up that like long point of one of the questions was, have you provided material assistance to a terrorist group? And he's like, well, what's material assistance? And the guy's like, did you ever fill up your dad's car with gas? Did you ever pick up anyone from the airport? And he's like, well, yeah, of course. And the guy's like, well, that's material assistance. And he's like, it's like you're rejected. But the guy's like, okay, well, like let's think about how ridiculous this is. Like U.S. taxpayer dollars fund, the PLO. And so essentially, you've also provided material assistance to a terrorist group. I mean, this is insane. And to an extent, he's right. Like, uh,
Yeah, it's kind of messed up from like the American perspective. It feels like we're kind of, I mean, we are essentially funding both sides.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, that's kind of the frustrating part as an American.
right. I agree. Um, and
Yeah.
then there was, I mean, sort of as like a side story in the book was the PLO at some point um, rejected violence, and they then opened up and to do that in doing that they were then able to I think set up a nonprofit in the states. And after his book, an attorney came out and said, well, they haven't rejected violence because they just committed this terrorist attack. So he sued the nonprofit, like the PLO nonprofit, for like $1 billion.
Yep.
Just,
And he wanted his 20%. He wanted Mosab to testify on his behalf.
right, right.
Yeah.
Which brings up, and I think they eventually got thrown in jail. Like there was some like cash. There was some other. I don't think that case won, but there was a different case where they were smuggling money to Hamas in cash, some other charity organization. I'm blanking on
Hmm.
the name, where they got jail time.
Hmm. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, Mossab is kind of talking there. He's kind of feels like a pawn that people like companies and lawyers are just trying to use. Um, I'm trying to find. Yeah, it was the Holy Land Foundation. um, which was the largest Islamic charity in the U.S., and it was really funding a funding conduit for Hamas. And Mossad was going to show how the money was going to Hamas and not the Palestinian people. But actually, this might have been this. I don't think this was the $1 billion case, but yeah. And then I had a note that Mossad wanted 5 million in citizenship to help. Those are his terms. Like, welcome to America. and Mossab was like rejected on that offer, and the Holy Land Foundation was found guilty without without Mossab testifying. um, so I guess it's rewinding down. I mean, like, did this book really jive with what you thought it was going to be like?
Uh, yeah, not. I mean, the main thing was he was much more uh critical of Israel in the beginning than I was expecting him to be after hearing him talk. That was sort of surprising. And then, I mean, I didn't really know outside of like the stuff solely associated with his time in the West Bank. I didn't really know anything about it. So it was interesting to kind of hear about his journey. And I mean, I feel like he was treated pretty badly when he got here, and like how the government treated him. And like, I mean, I guess on the same note, it's like easy to look at it from after the fact and be like, yeah, like, why would we be so mistrustful of this person? But like, looking at it in real time, I probably would be mistrustful as well. So,
Yeah, I mean, you got the son of the Hamas leader, um, sitting in your country.
right, and especially if the Israelis won't confirm it that he was an agent, like, yeah, why would you, believe it? And I think it is sort of bad of the Israelis not to confirm it for him, because to me, it sounded like they were just being petty, that he wanted out and they didn't want him to leave.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I picked the book originally because I thought it would be more about like the dynamics of like the Muslims versus the Jews and maybe some of more of the history. I mean, I'm still happy we read this because it still did give some insights into the dynamics. I feel like I do have a better understanding of like a typical person in the West Bank. Um, but yeah, I kind of wish I would have gotten more insights into like some of the underlying like religious like theology or like some of those dynamics. Um, but I guess we'll just have to I'll have to pick another book. That might um but I did start to like appreciate, I think, just how much languages can help understanding, because if you can't speak the language of the other side, it's really hard to come to any sort of agreement. So I don't know if that message is more of us need to learn Arabic to like kind of understand, or but it feels like you got to be able to communicate with the other side, otherwise you're not gonna make any moves.
Yeah, so it's sort of funny you say that. Like, I don't know. There was just a debate at the Oxford Union where Mossad
Oh,
spoke, and it was somewhat of a sham debate. Like, the president of the union is Egyptian, and he was very pro-Palestinian, and he essentially packed packed the chamber with all like pro-Palestinian people. And Mossab and this other Arab Israeli were speaking on the against side, that Israel is committing a genocide, along with
Hausdorff.
yeah, Natasha. Did you listen to the debates?
I did.
Okay. So yeah, so it's interesting to hear him say like what they were yelling in Arabic to them, which was like
Mhm.
incredibly violent things that the like they essentially got thrown out for saying very, very mild things. Because
Mhm.
one of the pro speakers said like October 7th was like incredibly heroic and something along those lines. And then Mosab said something along the lines of like Palestinians are like lazy, and he was like screamed out the room.
Mhm. I
Sort of an
thought
interesting
I don't think
thing.
I listened to the full Mossad talk, but the other Arab Israeli I thought had a great talk.
Yeah, he had a great speech.
Where he was describing, you're talking about apartheid. I'm giving orders to like 10 Jewish Israelis in the IDF. And, that I was always told like once the Jews like have no purpose for you, they'll leave you behind. And there was a time where he was fighting and he got wounded, and the other
Carried him
Israelis could
out.
have just left him, but they carried him out over miles on a stretcher. And yeah, it was a really good speech, I thought. Um, but there was another guy who I heard recently, an Israeli, who ended up learning Arabic, or trying to, and then he was going on these kind of like WhatsApp, but these like groups where he could talk Arabic with other people, and he was kind of being an agent. He was pretending to be like an American that had like Syrian roots or something, but he was saying his parents didn't want him to know anything about Islam or where they came from, and he was kind of talking to these people in like Iran and Syria, Jordan, Egypt about the actual situation. And some of the things he they started talking about was like, for example, he would bring up like, do you support like Hamas and Hezbollah? And like a lot of them would say no, like we don't. And then he's like, oh well, you must be happy Israel's fighting them, or like basically fighting for you to destroy them. And then they're like, you must not be Muslim because you can't understand, because it's not really about that. And they're kind of talking to him like, and this is just the history they're told. Like they're told King Solomon is Muslim. They believe Abraham was also Muslim somehow. So like, if you're coming at it with such, if like the other side really believes this and then we believe one thing, like it's hard to ever. And basically his conclusion was it is over religion. It is a religious war. It is not just over territory. It's not just like, I guess, a land issue. It's a religious issue.
Yeah, there was a professor I heard give a interview where he did an actual study that came to the same conclusion that it is a religious war. To your point about Abraham, Abraham is, I think, the father of Islam, but he was not a Muslim. Um, it
Well, I,
was he gave
well, I thought
birth
Abraham.
to
Uh-huh.
he gave birth from a different woman to, I think, Ishmael, who was then eventually the father of Muhammad, or was like the descendant of Muhammad.
Well, it was like Ishmael and Jacob, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then there was Ishmael. I think
Right.
Isaac.
No. Ishmael was Abraham's son from like a slave, I think,
Okay, but I
or a
guess
servant.
the uh-huh. But like Jews believe, who was the first Jew? It was
Abraham.
Abraham.
Right.
So so if it's kind of like both cannot be true, I feel. Um
No, no, what I'm okay. Uh, well, he can't be both Jewish and Muslim. But what I'm saying is he is. I think they link the Genesis back to him because then Ishmael is the chain that led to Muhammad.
mhm, right, but yeah, and it's like but I guess I'm saying Abraham can't be a Muslim and a Jew.
Yeah, well, yes,
Um
because Islam did not exist when Abraham was alive.
But if you ask a Muslim, that's not what they say. So I guess um sorry, I'm just looking up. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah. Ishmael, yeah, Abraham is the father of both Isaac and Ishmael, right? Okay. Uh, um, but and it's all I don't know if you ever go on YouTube and watch man, I'm blanking on his name, but it's the Ask Project where he like goes to like he'll go to the West Bank and ask questions that like Israelis will write in for him to ask them, and then he'll go to Israelis and ask them questions that people in the West Bank write in. And like one of the questions the Israelis wanted to know is like to the people in the West Bank that are Muslim, um, before your ancestors were Muslim, were they Jews or Christians? Because Muslims only been around like 1400 years, or at least that's what how I how we view it, I guess. Um, but like when they answer, they're like, no, they're just Muslim. My ancestors were never Christian, never Jewish. So it's kind of like these worlds that like can't coexist.
Um, yeah, you're right. That would be a problem then.
And it's yeah, so but I don't know. Yeah. Sometimes I just think it's so much more complicated than I think. And I thought it was complicated before, but then when I hear stuff like this, I'm like, what?
Well, I think you're right because I think most Westerners view it as an issue with. I feel like they view it almost as an economic issue or like a land issue. And that you're right, it's over living standards and the land. And I think you're correct. I think it's totally driven by religion. And you
Uh-huh.
have issues like that, they will not. And I feel like that's kind of if you like read the history, that's kind of how it plays out because they've been offered land. They were essentially offered what would have been a vibrant economy, and it's still always violence. So
Mhm.
I just think you kind of have to exclude those options. And then the fact that, Gaza was under control of Egyptian rule for like 20 years and they were not complaining about self-determination. And same with the West Bank when it was under Jordanian rule. They weren't caring
Yeah,
about who was controlling them. Yeah, because between
right.
48 and 67, Jordan controlled the West Bank and Egypt controlled Gaza. And they didn't, you didn't hear about Palestinian people's movement in those times because they were under Muslim control.
Mhm. But then, like, I mean that yeah, exactly. And I think the Arab Israeli during the Oxford brought up that exact point that you never heard other places come, an outrage that the Palestinians don't have a state when Egypt was controlling Gaza and Jordan was controlling the West Bank. And someone would go further and saying the Palestinians already have a state. It's called Jordan. It's like, uh, and but then I also have like when Seyfuddin Amos spoke in some of those debates, his view, and I honestly don't know what he is. I mean, sometimes I hear him say he's Lebanese, sometimes he refers to himself as Palestinian, but like he's kind of saying it's all just property rights. It's a property rights issue. And the more I hear from these different points of view, I just don't believe that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I feel like that's like obviously just not true because, you know, they would have accepted all the deals then. I mean, you essentially have no leverage, you have no power, and you're offered something. I feel like, I don't remember what year it was when allegedly Arafat got like 95% of what he was asking for and they turned it down. So and you have no power and you're given 95% of what you want, if you think that's really the issue, you would take it.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
Saifuddin, I mean, he had a discussion with Konstantin Kisin on trigonometry where he just came off as just such a jerk. I feel like he kind of lost like all credibility.
I don't know. It's yeah, it's yeah, I could talk a long time about this stuff, I guess. But I don't know. Any last thoughts, Al? Anything you're gonna take with you from this book through life?
I mean, a lot of the points about like introspection. Uh, it's like even when he had a lot of money, he still at times, like in the book, he's talking about like sort of feeling empty and kind of kind of was like wading into, he's like it seemed like to me like he was like yearning for a family. I think that's sort of what I was going to take away from it.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. Um, yeah. And I think he did a very good job, kind of. Well, what's the phrase that gets used a lot by investors? Like firm beliefs loosely held. Like he's very confident in his beliefs, but he's still open to getting new information that would sway his mind to going to the other side, or switching course. So I think that's also something to be it's to be admired. So yeah. Okay. So with that, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you listen to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. For the original episodes, the OGs, please visit brothersonbooks.com. I am Jack Allwild, and with me, as always, is my brother Alex Allwild. Al, it's been a pleasure. And the next episode we have is going to be returning guest Jordan Grummett with his book, The Purpose Code, which is going to be a doozy. We've already recorded. It's a great episode, lot to think about, and that book should be released very soon. So, yeah, good episode, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, Jack.